welcome to NTD China News. I'm Karen Chang. Making headlines this Wednesday, March 27th. China says it fired flares at a Vietnamese fishing boat but says there was no damage. A step closer to a major gas deal between Russia and China. And the CNOOC Nexen deal raises human rights concerns in Canada. China has admitted its Navy fired flares at a Vietnamese fishing vessel on March 20th, but is denying Hanoi's claim that it caused one fishing boat to catch fire. According to a statement issued by China's Defense Ministry, the Chinese Navy fired 2 flares at 4 boats. It says both flares spurred up en route and no weapons were fired. The Vietnamese government lodged a complaint with the Chinese embassy in Hanoi, calling the incident very serious. It is asking for compensation for the damage and punishment for the perpetrators. China claims the fishing vessels ignored warnings to leave waters near the Paracel Islands that China claims it has rights over. The U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates that the South China Sea holds around 11 billion barrels of oil and possibly 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. China, along with the Philippines, Brunei, Taiwan and Malaysia, all lay competing claims over the waters. China and Russia are closer to a major agreement for the supply of natural gas to China. Russian gas giant Gazprom has agreed on the prices for gas to be shipped through an eastern pipeline. The 30-year deal would begin in 2018 and will pump around 38 billion cubic meters of gas a year, but that number could go as high as 60 billion. The agreement has been a long road. For 15 years, the two sides had been unable to agree upon a price. The deal could see China surpass Germany as the largest importer of Russian gas. The plan to supply Russian gas to China through an eastern pipeline follows earlier plans to build the pipeline along a western route. But that move drew objections from environmental groups who say it could hurt a World Heritage protected site. Our correspondent from Russia brings us the story.
A natural gas pipeline from northern Siberia to China. Russian gas giant Gazprom wants to build it, but there's a problem. The pipeline runs through an area rich in archaeological artifacts. In fact, 27 have been found on the Ukok Plateau. Environmental organizations and UNESCO have protested the construction for 5 years. They want to make sure the pipeline stays clear of the World Heritage Site, the Golden Mountains of Altai.
Plateau Ukok
is one of the few natural heritage sites in Russia, protected by UNESCO. It's not surprising that its archaeological and natural value is so high that it's recognized globally. UNESCO recognition means that it's not only up to the Russian government to decide what to do in the area, it's a place of global significance.
At almost 6,600 feet above sea level, the plateau has unique flora and fauna that's best kept away from human activity. Situated along the border of Russia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and China, it's spiritually important for the people of the Altai Mountains, as well as Mongolian and Chinese Buddhists.
The mummy of a young woman was found.
20 years ago, the mummy of a young woman, known as the Princess of Ukok, was discovered here. Locals believe the desecration of her grave caused an earthquake in 2003. Now they're cautious about any construction proposal.
Generally, construction is not allowed there. It's a holy place. There's our princess there. She was buried there, and there are warriors there too. There's not just her, there are warriors there too.
More than 150 archaeological sites have been discovered here, and the pipeline's route passes through some of them. Opponents to the gas pipeline do understand its economic significance. China is the biggest energy consumer in the world, and Russia has plenty to offer. But an expert on Russia's extractive industry says a pipeline through the Ukok Plateau isn't the only way.
There is a much simpler way. It is along the trade tract, along the border with Mongolia, and we can distribute gas to Mongolia too, which will add some economic benefits for this route from Mongolia to China.
Gazprom has declared 2013 its year of ecology. The World Wildlife Fund is now asking the company to make the year count and look for another way to build the gas pipeline away from the World Heritage protected Ukok Plateau. NTD News, Russia.
To fuel China's large energy appetite, Chinese state-run oil giant CNOOC finalized its takeover of Canadian oil producer Nexen in February. It was a controversial deal for the Canadian government, and this week a forum in Ottawa highlighted one shortfall of the Canadian-China trade relations, namely the human rights abuses that Chinese state-run companies like CNOOC are involved in.
Canada should be paying more attention to human rights in China as it pursues trade ties with the country. That was the message from a forum on Monday evening in Ottawa, organized by NGO One Free World International. Canadian-China trade ties came under close scrutiny when Nexen Oil Company was acquired by Chinese state-run CNOOC. Critics of the deal raised security concerns, as well as CNOOC's involvement in religious persecution under the Chinese regime.
State-owned entity like CNOOC come in is problematic because they have a history around the world that's very questionable in human rights.
One of the main groups that CNOOC helped the Chinese regime target was practitioners of the Falun Gong spiritual practice. The Communist Party has carried out a systematic campaign against the practice since 1999. CNOOC's complicity with the persecution includes sending security officials to search Falun Gong employees' homes, helping police to detain them, and withholding pay or firing those who would not give up the practice.
A state-owned entity like CNOOC coming in is problematic because they have a history around the world that's very questionable in human rights.
CNOOC has also been accused of forcing the resettlement of Tibetan nomadic herders during its operations in China.
We have to stand for human rights. We can't turn a blind eye to what's happening to Falun Dafa and Falun Gong practitioners. We can't turn a blind eye to the self-immolations of Tibetan Buddhist monks in this desperation.
The Canadian government approved CNOOC's $15.1 billion purchase of Nexen last December, and the deal concluded late February. Prime Minister Stephen Harper said the takeover was a net benefit for the Canadian economy. Critics say the government only took economic considerations into account when approving the deal.
A U.S. court has this week sentenced a Chinese engineer for stealing military technology secrets and exporting them to China. Liu Sixing was working at the New Jersey-based L3 Communications Company between 2009 and 2010. He was found guilty of stealing information on U.S. missile, rocket and drone technology while working there. He was arrested in 2011, accused of presenting information to universities and conferences in China. Liu was sentenced to more than 5 years in prison and ordered to pay a fine of $15,000. And coming up after the break, China's urbanization drive is hurting farmers but is putting trillions of dollars in the pockets of local governments. The smog is back as Beijing faces another day of dangerous pollution levels. And meet one environmentally conscious designer at the China Fashion Week. And welcome back. China's urban population has just jumped to more than 700 million. The huge leap from only about 200 million in the past 3 decades has caused phenomenal economic growth, but also a host of problems. Who have been the winners and losers in this urbanization push? Let's find out.
Imagine permanently relocating half the population of the United States in only 7 years. That's what Chinese leaders are hoping to do throughout China. By 2020, the Chinese regime wants 60% of the country's 1.4 billion people out of the countryside and into cities. And the urbanization push is making local officials rich. In the past decade, some local governments have made up to 30 trillion yen from the urbanization push. Top Chinese economist Wu Jinglian from the Development Research Center of the State Council gave the figure during a forum on March 23rd. The conservative estimate is equal to almost $5 trillion US. But while local governments are getting rich, farmers are losing out. Selling land to developers has become hugely profitable for authorities because even though they're meant to compensate farmers, often it's too little, if anything is paid at all.
The government promises them free housing and resettlement fees, but it fails to uphold this. Now migrant farmers have to find their own housing and pay for everything themselves.
China's local government relies so heavily on selling land because it's a major source of revenue. In the US, local governments can issue municipal bonds to raise money. But in China, local governments basically have to make their own money and land is easily accessible.
The land in China is not privately owned. The state has a monopoly. The land prices is set by the state, and all of the land development is approved by the government, so the whole thing is directed by the government.
The urbanization push is part of the regime's attempt to sustain economic growth that is slow to a 13-year low of 7.8%. But the cost of social unrest and unchecked official corruption created by urbanization could be a higher price to pay.
As China's local governments cash in on real estate development, they're amassing a lot of debt at the same time. Altai Securities, a major Chinese securities broker, says local government debt could reach 16.3 trillion yuan this year. That's around $2.5 trillion and almost 30% of China's GDP. Ballooning local debt is a big problem for the Chinese regime. Much of the borrowing goes towards infrastructure development, a main component in China's economic growth. But these investments yield low returns, and that means the governments are not able to pay the money back. China's new leaders this year vow to curb borrowing to prevent disastrous consequences to the economy. The threat of a banking collapse is a very real concern for the world's second-largest economy. Hong Kong economist Larry Lang said earlier this month that it's already started to happen, triggered by debt defaults from local governments. It's another day Beijing's pollution has hit an extremely unhealthy level. Thick smog covered the Chinese capital, raising health concerns among the public.
The Chinese capital was shrouded in thick smog again on Wednesday. Pollution in Beijing regularly exceeds 200 on an index that measures tiny pollutants called PM2.5. Above 300 is considered hazardous, while the World Health Organization recommends a daily level of no more than 20. These fine particles are a health hazard because they could cause severe respiratory disease.
I read warnings of heavy pollution on the internet yesterday. Because I have minor rhinitis and pharyngitis, I often wear masks in the recent 2 years. I can totally feel the difference. I feel more comfortable when I am wearing masks.
On Wednesday, the PM2.5 index maintained by the U.S. Embassy in Beijing hit 242. It has been described as an extremely unhealthy level of pollution. Some said the health concerns are real and everyone should try harder to ease Beijing's pollution.
I think the only thing we can do is avoid going out as much as possible and use air purifiers at home. We should also drive less and use public transportation. That is all we can do.
In this city of 20 million people, the growing number of high polluters such as power stations, factories, trucks, cars and coal-burning homes are all contributing to the perennial grayness of the Beijing sky.
Despite the smog-filled air, China's Fashion Week kicked off in Beijing. And in a city known for its pollution, one designer is taking a green look at fashion.
China's Fashion Week kicked off in Beijing on Tuesday. This late autumn to mid-winter lineup looks pretty icy cold. Yuan's pink geometric ice crystals line is made for the cold and snowy days of winter, but his work is starting to get a little tinge of green in it. Bing is combining high fashion with concern for the environment. He says he takes into account the resources that are used to make his fabrics.
We made the clothes with few denim fabric because jeans need a large amount of dye and washing water, which pollute the environment. We took environmental protection into consideration while choosing the fabrics.
Yuan makes another statement as he rides his bicycle out on the runway. In a city that has become famous for its smog, Yuan wants the fashion world to know that 2 wheels are better than 4. China's Fashion Week in Beijing started on Sunday and will run till March 30th.
And that's all for this broadcast of NTD China News. For more of our China-related content, visit our website at ntd.tv or subscribe to our YouTube channel, NTD on China. Coming up next is a segment of the 9 commentaries on the Communist Party. Stay tuned.